Welcome back. Now that we have a pawn class, it's time for us to start adding some components to our pawn. So here's our pawn. It's called BP Bird. Now we just have a default scene root. Now we're definitely going to want a mesh so we can see the bird itself. But that's not the first component we're going to add. We're actually going to start with a capsule, and we're going to use this capsule for basic collisions in the world. Let's talk about why. Every mesh in a game is made up of polygons. So our simple bird here actually has quite a few polygons that make up its mesh. Now for this particular bird, this isn't a very large number of polygons as far as meshes go, but it's still a lot if we want to detect collisions. Let's say that in our world we have some object flying towards the bird, and eventually that object may collide with the bird. And we may wish for the engine to detect this collision so something can happen in response. Now, checking for collisions against the mesh itself is very expensive. This bird is made up of lots and lots of polygons, triangles to be exact. And to detect a collision with our actual mesh, this would require the engine to perform lots of calculations under the hood to see if this flying object has collided with any one of those polygons. So because this is an expensive operation, we typically have a different solution. We use a more basic shape for our collision, such as a capsule. If our bird has a capsule component, then when an object comes along and it gets close enough to the bird, as soon as it collides with that capsule, we can detect that, and the engine can perform a vastly lower number of calculations to do so. So for this reason, we often have a component that has some basic geometry designed for handling these collisions. So let's talk a little bit about a capsule component. Unreal Engine has a class called UCapsule Component. You see the U there? That should tell you that this is derived from UObject and is not an actor. So we know about the UObject class, and derived from that, we have UScene Component, which has a transform and the ability to support attachment. Derived from UScene Component, we have UCapsule Component. Now, this is an oversimplification of the inheritance hierarchy. There are other classes derived from these objects, so this chain is much longer than we see here. But what we're concerned with is the capsule component. We know that it's a UScene component, so it supports attachment and has a transform. And a capsule component is used for simple collision. It's really easy to detect collision with a capsule. Its geometry is very simple. And it also has the ability to be rendered as red lines in the editor, so we can visualize it and see what that collision volume looks like. So let's add one of these capsule components to our bird class. So we'll jump back into Visual Studio and go into bird.h. And I'd like to add a capsule component variable to our class. Now, this can be a private variable. It's generally a good idea to keep variables private if we don't plan on exposing them to other classes. And a capsule is sort of internal information for this pawn. So we're going to add a private section down here at the bottom. And we can make a UCapsule component pointer, and we can call this capsule. Now notice right off the bat that UCapsule component gets red squiggles. And if we hover over it, it says identifier UCapsule component is undefined. And if we tried to compile this, we'd be met with a compiler error. Let's go ahead and compile and see what happens. First, I'm going to close out of the Unreal Engine editor as we're compiling here from Visual Studio. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Control B to compile this module. Let's see what the compiler tells us. Now, we have several error messages. We see some syntax error messages talking about missing semicolons before the asterisk. That's because it doesn't really expect us to create a pointer with a type that it knows nothing about. So it's wondering if maybe we meant to say UCapsule component semicolon or something like that, which of course we didn't. Now all of these messages are referencing bird.h at line 24. That's what this 24 in parentheses means. So our simple capsule component pointer is wreaking all sorts of havoc in the error log. It says missing type specifier int assumed. So because it doesn't recognize this as a type, it's wondering if maybe we forgot to include the type. Now, all of these errors can be avoided by simply making sure that we don't use undefined types. Now, this type is defined in Unreal Engine, but it's defined in a specific header file. Let's figure out what that header file is. Now, here's the Unreal Engine 5 documentation. This can be very useful for a number of reasons. For one, it has lots of walkthroughs that can teach you things. But perhaps the most valuable use of this is that we can look up classes here in the search bar. I can search for Capsule Component, and we have Capsule Component along with the Capsule Component functions that it may think we're interested in. Now, if we click on the first link here to Capsule Component, here's the documentation for it. And it says, a capsule generally used for simple collision. Bounds are rendered as lines in the editor. And it also shows the inheritance hierarchy with Capsule Component at the bottom. Notice that it shows UObject here. And it shows that UObject is derived from UObject base utility, which is derived from UObject base. Remember, I told you the inheritance hierarchy was more complicated than what we were looking at in our slide. Now, based on UObject, we have UActor component. Based on that, UScene component. Then UPrimitive component. Then UShape component. And finally, UCapsule component. So each child class further down the hierarchy adds more and more functionality. And the UCapsule component is down here at the bottom in this chain. Now, under References, it shows us where the header file exists in the engine where this class is defined. And it also shows us that if we want to include that header file, we only need to include this part of the path. Everything after classes doesn't need to be included. Visual Studio will know where to look for this header file as long as we provide components/capsulecomponent.h. Now, beneath this, we have variables, and the main variables that belong to this class are the capsule half height and the capsule radius. These will determine the shape of the capsule. Now, we see that it has a constructor as well as some functions, and most of the functions have a short description. So definitely use the documentation as a resource whenever you need to find out information about a particular class in the Unreal Engine hierarchy. Now, the reason I'm coming to this documentation page is because we need to include the header file where capsule component is defined. So I'm simply going to copy this include here and come back into Visual Studio. Now, if I wish to get rid of that compiler error, perhaps the easiest way would be to scroll up to the top here and include it. Now, something you should know, if you're going to include header files in an Unreal Engine header file, we need to include it before the .generated.h header file. The .generated.h must be the final include. It must be the last one, otherwise we'll have errors. And that's because when Unreal Engine includes this header file, the preprocessor will paste in tons of lines of code auto-generated for this class to work and integrate with the reflection system. So we need to make sure to include this above the .generated.h file, so we can include it here. Now that we're including capsulecomponent.h, if we scroll down, notice the red squiggles are gone. And if we hit Control-B to compile, we'll see that we've succeeded. At the bottom it says build 1 succeeded, which means no compiler errors. We've successfully compiled. Now, including the header file right here in bird.h is not the best practice in general. And we'll learn why in the next lecture, but for now, since we know that this compiles successfully, we can create our capsule component. Now, if we wish to see it in the Blueprint editor, we have to expose it to blueprints. That means we need a uProperty. So let's add the uProperty macro to this. And we can make it visible with visible anywhere. Now, we know that this variable is just a pointer. We haven't actually created a capsule object. Remember, we need to create a default sub-object for our capsule. And we do that in the constructor. So let's go into bird.cpp, and we'll do that here in the bird constructor. So what we'll do is we'll say capsule equals, and we'll use create default subobject. And we'll specify uCapsule component, and we also need to specify an internal name for this. We can call this capsule. So we're using the create default subobject factory to create the default subobject for our capsule. Now, if we want to, we can make the capsule our root component. And then that default scene root will be gone. And this is typically what we do with capsule components. We usually make them the root. You don't have to, but for this class we will. Now, root component is protected, which means we have access to it in child classes. So if we wanted, we can say root component equals capsule and overwrite the root component this way. Now, we also have the inherited setter function, set root component. And we can set the root component by passing in a scene component. And we know that capsule is a scene component, so this will satisfy this input. So we can pass capsule in here, and this would do the same thing. Now, whether we use assignment with the assignment operator or the setter function set root component, the result is the same. If we use the setter like this, then somewhere down the line, if Unreal Engine decides to make the root component a private variable, then our code would still compile because set root component is a public function. But either way, we're setting the root component to be the capsule. So we can compile this and check it out in the editor. Now I've closed my editor, so I'm going to hit Control F5 to compile and launch the editor. And I'll go ahead and click Open down here at the bottom right, and click Open Full Blueprint Editor. And here in the Components panel, I see my capsule, and it's now the root. And if I click on the Viewport tab, I see my capsule in the viewport. Now it's kind of scaled up for a sort of humanoid figure. We could place a human character there, for example, and the capsule would pretty much cover the volume of that character. But we can change the capsule half height and the capsule radius by selecting our capsule. And in the Details panel, under Shape, we have those variables here. And we can assign values directly into those boxes, or we can click and drag them to change those values in a smooth manner. Now, we can drag the capsule half height down until we have a really small capsule, something like what a bird would need. So I think a capsule half height of 20 and a capsule radius of 15 is probably good for now. Now, if we wanted to set these from C++, we could do that too. Back here in Visual Studio, after we've created the capsule, we can access those variables. So I can say capsule, and this is a pointer, so I'm using the arrow operator here, and I can type capsule half height. And if I scroll down in this pop-up, I see this function, set capsule half height. That's a public function that we can use. Now, it has an input parameter of type float called half height. So we could pass in, say, 20.f here. Now, the second input is a Boolean called update overlaps. It's set to true by default. This means that if our capsule is set to trigger events in response to overlaps, which is something we'll learn about later, then scaling the capsule like this would allow it to check to see if it's now overlapping with something after changing that half height. Since that input has a default value, we don't need to pass one in. We can leave it at its default value of true. Now we can set the radius similarly. We can take the capsule variable, and there's a function called setCapsleRadius. And it has a float for the radius. We can pass in 15.f. And it has the same Boolean, bUpdateOverlaps, set to true by default, so we don't need to pass that in. So now we've set this in C++. So now that we have a capsule, we can use the capsule for collisions, and we don't have to use our actual bird mesh, which we don't have yet. We'll add that soon. But this is our first step, adding our capsule component, and we've assigned it to be the root component for our pawn. Great job! In the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we included the capsule component header file here in bird.h and why that's not necessarily the best practice. I'll see you soon.